Okay, yeah, 13, this is the video for Tuesday's lesson next week on altitude training and the effects of altitude on performance. And you'll get less of me talking this time round as requested, or trying to make things a little bit more, spice it up, and there are a couple of video clips embedded in this as well that'll hopefully make sense to you. So, as we're aware, supply of oxygen is essential for performance, the working muscles, and exposure to high altitude has a major effect on performance, and that's what this video is all about. If you'll see that altitude, and as altitude increases, so you've got 0 being sea level, as altitude goes up in meters, what the key thing for you here is to look at this pp, that's partial pressure of oxygen, and you'll see that as the height in meters increases, the partial pressure of oxygen decreases, and that's key. Alright, so the partial pressure of oxygen in the atmospheric air is significantly reduced, and this is called a hypoxic condition and leads to something called hypoxia. And hypoxia is basically a shortage of oxygen in the body, and the hypoxic conditions are a shortage of oxygen in the air that's around us. As you can see, the reduction of oxygen's partial pressure causes knock-on effects. They decrease the efficiency of the respiratory process. They basically make it harder for us to breathe in oxygen and get that to our working muscles, and this consequently negates performance. Performance gets worse. I'm just going to show you a video clip now where you'll see some tests that have been carried out in a lab, so you can actually see how much worse things actually get.
To examine the possible physiological effects of competing in high altitude, I'm subjecting myself to an altitude simulation test here in the ESPN Sports Science Lab. Elevation, 750 feet. First, we establish my baselines. During strenuous exercise, the percentage of oxygen in my blood remains in the high 90s. After 20 minutes, we get measurements of my reaction time and grip strength. Now, to mimic the conditions in Denver, we brought in a high altitude simulator.
What we're doing is we're setting this to simulate an altitude of 5,600 feet, so a little bit higher than a mile. So the amount of oxygen you're going to be receiving through the mask, which is the only way you can receive your oxygen, is going to simulate that environment.
At an elevation of just under a mile, the air inside Denver's Pepsi Center is 18% less dense than the air at sea level, meaning each breath contains 18% less oxygen. At that elevation, hypoxia, or altitude sickness, can set in when the body's blood oxygen saturation level falls below 95%. Because my body is not acclimated to this altitude, just 6 minutes in, my blood oxygen level has plummeted to 86%. But as my body becomes acclimated, this number slowly rises. Oxygen is essential for a chemical reaction in the cells that produces energy. If red blood cells aren't getting enough oxygen, the body senses danger and compensates by steering oxygen to the vital organs rather than our extremities.
Your fingers are numb?
This is one reason why after 20 minutes of high altitude exposure, my grip strength decreases by more than 16%. And on average, my reaction times slow by more than 25%.
So you can already see that is having, only after 20 minutes, is having a negative effect on that person's performance. The other thing to be aware of is that endurance athletes would be far significantly more, would have a greater impact there. You know, I was reading an article the other day about an athlete who runs 28 minutes for 10k, or sub 28 minutes for 10k, and an altitude of just over 10,000 feet, his best time is 36 minutes. So you can see there the massive difference that makes. So what you basically just heard described in that video, and this flow chart goes round in that direction that I'm showing you. So you've got a decreased, so the effects of altitude on the respiratory system, we've got a decreased pressure in the oxygen in alveoli. Alright, so hypoxia, like we said, due to decreased partial pressure in an atmospheric air. Alveoli, as you'll know from last year, are in our lungs, the area of our lungs that the capillarization takes place, and that then causes a reduction in the diffusion gradient. So the amount of oxygen and CO2 that is being diffused through the alveoli into capillaries around those muscle cells. That gives a decrease in oxygen and hemoglobin association. Yeah, so the amount of hemoglobin that have oxygen attached to them to become oxyhemoglobin, and this results in decreased oxygen being transported in the blood, like the video showed you. This, of course, then causes a reduction in the oxygen available to the muscles, yeah, because of that reduction in the diffusion gradient, so there's less oxygen being exchanged during breathing in, and that effect ultimately decreases our VO2 max, hence the reason our 10k runner was going so much slower. It decreases our aerobic capacity and decreases our aerobic performance, and you've also seen there that the reaction time and other effects that would come about too. Increase the onset of muscular fatigue. Other effects just to be aware of, and I'll just have to move my screen grab down so you can see. The colder air increases water loss, so as the air warms, moistens in the lungs, this leads to increased dehydration. It decreases muscle oxygen chemoreceptors, which stimulate the respiratory center, increasing the breathing rate, so we can potentially get hyperventilation. Yeah, so those chemoreceptors stimulate an increase in the respiratory rate, which leads sometimes to hyperventilation. And long-term effect is that the decreased partial pressure of oxygen increases hemoglobin and red blood cells, which increases external respiration and oxygen transport. Now this here, point 9, the long-term effect, is what we're going to come on to talk about. Because why? Why would you do that to yourself? That's obviously all those things are negative, as we spoke about. So I'm going to show you another video clip now, which will give you a good understanding as to why. This person does talk pretty fast, so you probably have to stop this video a couple of times, listen to it, but it is all very, very good stuff.
With the 2012 London Olympic Games beginning in under a month, many athletes have been hard at work training day in and day out. But some endurance competitors have found a secret advantage, one that lurks high above sea levels and upon mountaintops. No, it's not Julie Andrews, but rather the altitude itself. These athletes are using altitude training. Most of us have experienced being underwater and the pressure that comes along with swimming too deep. This is because the further down you go, the more water molecules you have above you, compressing the water down on you. This pressure can even cause your ears to pop. The same goes for air. At sea level, the air particles exist at a particular distance from one another, and the higher up you go, the less pressure they have on them, allowing them to spread apart more freely. But because of this spreading, the availability of oxygen for you to breathe in actually decreases. So how could this possibly create an advantage? Well, to compensate for the lack of available oxygen in your body, a protein in the kidney called erythropoietin is triggered and begins the production of more and larger red blood cells. Blood cells carry oxygen around the body, so the more blood cells you have, the more oxygen can be transported to your muscles and organs. But this process takes some time, which explains why some people feel sick when quickly traveling to high altitudes. Their body simply isn't receiving enough oxygen. Once the extra erythropoietin kicks in, their body will slowly acclimatize. But just as it takes time for the process to kick in, it can take a while for it to turn off as well. In fact, it can take up to 10 to 14 days after returning to lower altitudes. For this reason, many athletes will subject their bodies to high altitudes, preferably over 2,400 meters, so that when they come back down to lower levels, their body has increased blood cell mass and volume. This method has been dubbed the live high, train low principle, whereby the athletes train at lower altitudes in order to not overexhaust their body or get sick. This extra oxygen in the body not only creates a distinct advantage for aerobic athletes, but could be the distinction between bronze, silver, or gold. In fact, some facilities are now being created as low oxygen level houses. The athletes live and sleep inside of the house, but train outside where their bodies will take in higher oxygen levels, a somewhat natural alternative to drug enhancements. Got a burning question you want answered? Ask it in the comments, or... With the 2012 London Olympic Games beginning in under a month, many athletes...
And we can move that on. So hopefully that video makes sense. It explained an awful lot of stuff. You might need to watch that back over a couple of times, but basically, why do we train at altitude? Well, we do that because the body has to adapt, and those adaptations that are carried out can have a positive impact on performance. So you will have heard in the video that we get a release of the hormone erythropoietin EPO, and you'll sometimes see EPO mentioned. The reason you'll see that mentioned is because EPO is actually a banned drug. So you can get artificial EPO, something that sometimes cyclists are involved in, and the other endurance athletes, which is basically a cheat's way of creating what altitude training does, because this, like it says, stimulates an increase in capillarization, increases the hemoglobin, and increases the red blood cells. So EPO basically gives us more red blood cells, therefore more hemoglobin, therefore it gives us an increase in the oxygen carrying capacity. Just think about that for a second. We've got more red blood cells, so we've got more hemoglobin, so therefore we can carry more oxygen. It's quite simple when you think about it like that. That term erythropoietin is really important to you, because we'll talk about that as a performance-enhancing drug, but it's a naturally occurring hormone in the body. So what's the downside of that? Because that sounds brilliant. Obviously, the high altitude prevents us training at the same intensity because of the hypoxic air. So we effectively end up detraining, for a period of time, and this can have this can negate the positive adaptations because we don't get to train as hard for a period of time. And you'll have heard in the video I mentioned live high, train low. We're going to talk about some other adaptations of that as well. Live low, train high, etc., etc. In the lesson, we're going to talk about that. And these adaptations, as we're aware, only occur for a few days after returning to sea level. You're looking at up to 15 days. So up to 15 days. So, Mo Farah, Paula Radcliffe, all of these elite endurance athletes, they're all renowned for their altitude training and the impact that has on them. Just so you're aware of respiratory adaptations, it increases its efficiency, so the lungs and the respiratory system become more efficient. We get more oxygen to the working muscles. Ignore that page reference, that's not accurate. You want to be looking at page 26 primarily for this in our textbook, and you will see there's limited information about those respiratory adaptations there, but you will see elements of that. VO2 max and the lactic threshold increase, and they both have a positive impact. The lactic threshold is the exercise intensity at which lactic acid starts to kick in. So if we're thinking about our energy systems work from last time, when lactic acid starts to accumulate in the blood, basically it's being produced faster than it can be removed, and that's when we get this onset of blood lactic accumulation, which is the term OBLA that I mentioned to you last time, OBLA. So that is when the lactic threshold has been reached. Obviously, we know the benefits now are that we get an increase in our maximal work rate, particularly aerobic performance. It delays the anaerobic threshold, so it delays the time that our lactic system runs out when we're thinking about energy systems as well. And it reduces the effort of sub-maximal work, so we don't have to work as hard when we're just doing our basic parts of things, or we're not working at we're not working at a maximal level. We're working below maximal level, but we don't have to work as hard to be there. So that basically is the end of that. I know it's a little bit longer video clip. You will have to spend some time looking back over it, getting your notes down, and then we'll have a question on that in the lesson on Tuesday. All right, thanks very much.